Welcome back everybody to our studies in AQA A-level history. In this video we're going to talk about economic development that takes place from around 1783 to 1812. Specifically, the AQA specification requires of us to look at the economic developments, particularly industrialization, the growth of cotton and other industries, changes in power, and the condition of agriculture. Not particularly very specific, but still nevertheless important to examine. Now, we see that Britain in this time starts to witness the earlier stages of industrialization, with the growth of new industries like cotton and substantial changes in the way that power is structured between landowners, manufacturers, and the government. At the same time, we start to see the evolving of practices in agriculture, though at a slower pace, and many societal and economic changes were, of course, driven by the broader context of both war, imperial expansion, and then also, finally, on the end of that, the idea of industrial revolution. So let's examine these then. Let's begin with industrialization and economic growth. Britain's Industrial Revolution begins in the late 18th century and is accelerated in the early 19th century. And it transforms the economy from one that was primarily agricultural and handicraft-based into one that became dominated by mechanized production as well as factory-based manufacturing. One such example of this was the idea of the textile industry. This was at the forefront of this transformation. We see new machineries, such as James Hargreaves's spinning jenny in 1764, slightly prior to the period of study we're examining, but nevertheless an important contextual factor for examining the nature of industrialization. Equally, in 1769, we get Richard Arkwright's water frame. Again, another piece of machinery that gives you context as to the kinds of developments and improvements in industrial developments that take place during this time. And then finally in 1779, similarly, Samuel Crompton's spinning mule. All of these things revolutionized the textile production. These inventions allowed essentially for faster and more efficient production of things like yarn and cloth and laid the foundation for the growth of the cotton mill, which became a very central feature of the British industry during this period of time. The development of the steam engine, and particularly the improvements and influence of James Watt's in 1770s, also plays a pivotal role in industrialization. Essentially, Watts's steam engine allowed factories to move away from relying specifically on the power of water, and therefore enabling them to locate into areas that are not dependent on natural water sources. What this then did was lead to the growth of industrial centres, particularly in places like Lancashire, Glasgow, and the West Midlands, places that aren't necessarily right next to major sources of water, or that don't need to be next to major sources of water for their improvements in industrialization. The coal industry and iron production also expanded as well, providing energy and raw materials that were needed for a burgeoning manufacturing sector. And you can see how all of this contributes together to the growth of industrialization at a really, really fast pace. We see, for example, that iron production grew through the use of coke instead of charcoal, which was introduced by Abraham Darby in the late 18th century. And improvements in smelting techniques also helped to develop the growth of iron production. All of these things provided the materials and minerals for building railways, for ships, and for machineries. Ultimately, the coke-fueled blast furnace became central to the development of iron and the steel industries in these industrial hubs. The rise of industry then was accompanied by rapid urbanization, i.e. the rapid growth of urban centres where industrialization was central. People would move from the rural areas to towns and cities in order to work in factories. As population growth was spurred by improvements in health and agriculture, we can see that this contributes to a burgeoning labour force and a labouring workforce. New factory towns, like in places such as Manchester, Birmingham, and Leeds, grew rapidly as centres of manufacturing. The growth of the cotton industry, in particular places like Lancashire, became a focal point of industrial activity. And cities as they became overcrowded, it led to the development of, unfortunately, poorer working conditions and the rise of a newly industrialized working class. We'll get to that when we look at social conditions in a future video. In terms of the growth of the cotton and other key industries, we see that this early industrialization begins with the shifting patterns of the growth of the cotton industry, which transformed from a small scale hand loom based industry to a massive machinery driven sector. So, for example, by the 1790s, we see things like cotton mills opening in Lancashire, like I mentioned in the previous slide. And because of this, cotton becomes one of, if not the most important import and export that Britain can operate with. The establishment of large factories that were powered by steam engines allowed the industry to expand rapidly. We also see the extraction of from the Americas, the vast quantities of raw cotton from their colonies in America prior to the Civil War, and also from other colonies like India, gave them a competitive advantage in the manufacturing of cotton goods. So it says here prior to the American Civil War, because the American Civil War severely hampered and disrupted the trade networks when thinking about the expansion and importing of raw cotton, which actually is one of the reasons why we see the British swing to the east, if you will, and take a greater interest in places like Africa and the Far East, in places like the Middle East and in Asia and in India. This takes place partly as the result of the American Civil War. The result of these technological innovations then was that Britain was able to produce vast amounts of cheap cotton, which were then exported worldwide, and particularly to European and American markets. The largest cotton industry in the world by the early 19th century was in fact the British cotton industry. Other key industries then included things like wool and linen. While cotton took centre stage, these traditional industries, or more traditional industries like wool and linen, would also grow in terms of their popularity. Wool production remained vital, for example, in areas like Yorkshire, and the woolen industry was still nevertheless very important. As industrialisation grows, obviously coal and iron industries supported both industrial production and infrastructure development, particularly when thinking about the construction of railways, canals and ships. The growth of these industries is key as a driver of Britain's dominance in global trade. And then finally, new industries such as paper production, glass manufacturing, and chemical production, particularly in relation to the production of dyes for colour, is also emerging during this period, and we start to see growth in expansion and economic expansion as the result of some of these other key industries. These economic changes significantly alters the balance of power within Britain. We see a shift from the traditional agrarian land ownership to industrialized capitalism. So landowners, while still holding significant political and economic power in Britain, particularly through their influence in Parliament, remember, for the most part, only people who owned land could vote, we still also see that the Tory aristocracy remains dominant, but they are starting to face challenges. They're facing challenges from industrial capitalists who are beginning to grow in terms of their wealth and their prestige because of them getting in early on the industrialization revolution. The rise of the manufacturing class and the middle class creates a new power dynamic. As industry grows, factory workers, entrepreneurs, and also those who were just involved in trade become increasingly wealthier and more politically influential. These were tensions between essentially the old aristocracy, who controlled vast estates and agricultural wealth, and the newer industries, who were gaining wealth through the manufacturing of trade. We know already, as a result of the previous lesson, that William Pitt the Younger played a very key role in overseeing the growing economy, especially when we think about finance. So when we think about things such as the sinking fund, which managed national debt, banking and the credit system became more sophisticated. Institutions like the Bank of England would continue to play a far greater role during this period of time. We see the spread of capitalism, investment in factories, in railroads, in mining, all marks a shift away from the traditional feudal system that emerged away from this period of time. And we're seeing instead emerging capitalist economies where industrialists were the ones who held the significant wealth and the significant power. Finally then, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the condition of agriculture. And so during this time, although Britain was increasingly becoming an industrial economy, agriculture remained a very crucial and a very important part, especially in rural areas. So the condition of agriculture was undergoing a very significant transformation itself. Before 1783, we see the agricultural revolution. But during this period, it becomes more and more pronounced. So, for example, the enclosure movement was where we see landlords increasingly consolidate small farms into larger ones. This process involved essentially the privatization of common land, which had been used by small farmers for grazing and cultivation. Now, while this increased agricultural efficiency in the long run and ultimately led to more profitable farming in the long run, it would ultimately displace many small holders of land and contributed to a sense of rural poverty and migration to the cities to seek work. We start to see advances in farming techniques, things like crop rotation, the development of more efficient plows, the use of fertilizers, all leading to higher yields. The improvements, particularly in the growth of wheat, barley, and oats, help to feed this growing urban population. Additionally, we see selective breeding of livestock, particularly cattle and sheep, which led to the production of better quality meat and wool. The contribution, therefore, led to the growth in the food supply, and again increased the standards of living for those in the rural communities, and also helped to feed the growing urban population. And then finally, mechanization was still something that we shouldn't overlook. While it had a slower start in agriculture compared to industry, of course, the introduction of mechanical threshers and other innovations began to reduce the labour costs and increase productivity within large farms. And so really, despite these advantages, we have to make it very clear that we still are facing difficult conditions when thinking about agricultural life and rural life at this point, especially things like the enclosure movement having a negative impact on small farmers and rural labourers, leading to an increased social unrest in some of the regions. Many therefore were forced to work as landless labourers, or even to just move to the cities and face the prospect of working in industry. We will think about the concept of agricultural labourers and the poor in future lessons. In the next lesson, when we look at social developments of the working class, the middle class, the growing workforce, as well as the impact of the Combination Acts. But as a sort of conclusion, we can see that between 1783 and 1812, we see a profound economic transformation. Industrialisation is taking off, driven by innovations such as the cotton and the iron industries. And these industries generated massive wealth and urban growth, which had a major impact on the social dynamics of the time. And we'll think about these social dynamics in the next lesson, like I said, when we talk about social developments in this pre and sort of mid, shall I say, industrialisation period of Great Britain.